All right, again, welcome everyone to our August Facts and Snacks webinar. If you are comfortable sharing, please put your name and pronouns and organization in the chat. And we will get started in just a minute. Give it another minute for folks to log in. And we will have ASL and Spanish interpretation available. We will give you instructions about accessing the Spanish when we get started. So thank you all for being here. All right, it looks like that we don't have anybody hanging out in the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and get started with our instructions. So again, feel free to put your name, pronouns if you're comfortable sharing, and your organization in the chat. And some little tech overview for us for this webinar, just so you're all aware. It does say we are recording, and it does say up in the upper left of your screen, live with Zoom with rev.com. That actually supports our captioning. We are not live streaming anywhere. Just want to let you all know that. And we also do have Spanish interpretation available. So I want to let you all know that I'm going to explain how to access that. And then Lucia is going to also give you some instructions in Spanish, and we'll turn that channel on. So if you do want to access the Spanish language channel, once we activate it, you will click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish, and you should be able to hear the presentation interpreted into Spanish by Lucia.
Hola, bienvenido a todos. Estas juntas se está grabando, pero no está en vivo. Si ustedes necesitan lo que es traducción en español, abajo de la pantalla, en el icono del globo, pueden deslizar y toda la presentación estará disponible en español para quien los necesite.
Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you.
And then once you have that set up, can I get a confirmation that it's working from Roshan? Oh, I got a thumbs up from Lucia. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. And if folks want to access ASL interpretation, you should be able to pin the interpreter, Terry. If for some reason you cannot pin, feel free to message us either in the chat, and that can go to everyone, or that can go to myself, Brandy, or Regina. One of us can make sure you get the pinning privileges if we need to give you that. So just know that that's an option. We also have the option for closed captioning. So if you would like to turn that on at the bottom of your screen, you click on more where the three little dots are, and you can select captioning, and that should be available. You get to choose a language that works best for you. And that is it for our tech support. If you have questions, message us in the chat and we will do our best to support you. Let us know if something's happening or going awry. But otherwise, we're looking forward to this Facts and Snacks about the 2023 legislative session with our current public policy director, Katie Wolf. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Thanks, Brandy. This is Katie. Thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you who have heard, we're on our last statewide, this will be a similar recap as that, but we wanted to do a special Facts and Snacks about the legislative session so we could do a slightly deeper dive on some of the legislation and see if folks had questions. So we had a very successful 2023, which is great. We have wonderful champion, Representative Monica Duran, who's in the legislature. And she is also the majority leader, so it works out really well for both our priorities as well as her priorities. I figured I'd start with violence-free's priorities for 2023, and then we can talk about reproductive health and guns. And if we have time, we'll sneak in some child custody as well. But I wanted to make sure we get we start off with the violence-free priorities. So this picture is actually from a bill signing where most of our legislation got signed this year, all in one foul swoop, which was nice. So the three main priorities that we worked on this year legislatively were continuation on funding, With funding, Colorado has never dedicated any general fund dollars to funding domestic violence programs in any way. So there is the Domestic Violence Program, or DVP, that is under the Department of Human Services, and they oversee the FIPSA dollars that come from the feds, and they also oversee a very small pot of money, about $140,000 to $200,000 that comes from a tax checkoff that the state had given. 2 years ago, we were able to add some of the ARPA dollars, or the federal relief dollars, to DVP and some other sources. And it has been our goal since then to get Colorado to invest in prevention and to invest in our domestic violence programs across the state. So this year we were successful in getting our first general fund dollars allocated. It will be an ongoing battle to continue to keep these funds continued, but we were able to get $3 million put into DVP specifically. And that was through House Bill 1107. Initially, the bill was for 15 million, but based on some other places we were able to receive funds and how the budgeting process works, that number was taken down to 3 million. There was an additional 14 million that went through other pots through the long bill. And the long bill is the budget bill. We saw 8 million go to the Office of Victims Programs, or OVP, which is under the Division of Criminal Justice, or DCJ. Please let us know if you don't know these acronyms, and I'll do my best to remember to actually spell them out. 8 million was there, and that is where most of the VOCA grant money goes through, all of the VOCA grant money, not most of, for the state, for states and for programs that are applying. There was an additional 2 million that went into local veil, and then 4 million that went to the Community Crime Victim Services Program under the Department of Public Health and Environment. So a very successful funding year. In the last 3 years, with the help of our partners at the Capitol, CCASA and COVA, Violence Free has been successful in getting over $80 million allocated to victim programs across the state. So a really great win and an effort that we plan to continue on in the future. The next big push was for municipal court reform. I'm sure as advocates, you're familiar with some of the problems that we see in municipal court when it comes to domestic violence cases. The initial attempt was to try to move domestic violence cases completely out of municipal court. There are only 5 municipalities out of the, I'm forgetting the number, but it's over 200 off the top of my head, municipalities in the state. And so 5 municipalities, rather large ones, Denver being one, and that one was definitely at the highest caseload. There were some concerns about funding and revenue, of course, who will pay for the DAs, and some of the cost shifting that would have to happen that would fall then on the counties as opposed to the state or the municipalities, and the lost revenue that they see from the municipalities. So after a lot of political negotiations, we took a slightly different path. We required that the municipalities basically does everything that the counties are required or district court is required to do for victims and survivors, instead of removing it entirely. So if they do not comply with the Victims' Rights Amendment or the Victims' Rights Act, if they do not comply with firearm relinquishment, if they do not comply with the data sharing components of the bill, they are no longer allowed to see the municipal cases. And this bill also included a 5-year look back. So data will be presented every year on a number of different factors that we added into the bill. It will be presented to the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees. And the sponsors had that extended for 5 years so they can come back and reevaluate. That also kind of put the municipalities on notice that the intent from the legislature and the advocates is to move these cases out of municipal court. But this felt like a very important first political step. There are a lot more nuances to that, and I don't want to take up our whole time with that bill, but please message us. Let us know if you're interested in more details on that. And we will be getting out a TA document on this as well, technical assistance. The third priority that Violence Free had was around judicial training. This was House Bill 1108. It created a task force that has began meeting. They started their first meeting last month. It's 15 members that's composed of victim advocates, community members, attorneys, and judges. And they are reviewing judicial training specific to survivors and victims and how judges interact. In addition, there is a working group that is looking specifically at domestic relations cases. That was an additional bill that got merged with our bill. And so they have created their own little working group that will report back the findings as well. The result of the task force is to make recommendations. However, we will have to pursue further legislation in order to implement those. And there's a lot of strategy in figuring out kind of what our next steps look like there. I'll take a quick pause. Are there any questions that have popped up in the chat so far?
No, nothing yet.
Okay, thank you. All right. So the next big area that we looked at and bills we supported was on reproductive health legislation. It was a really big year for Colorado under reproductive health, considering the national news and turn that we've taken over the last year. Obviously, domestic violence survivors, abortion access is critically important. If for no other reason than the concept of autonomy is important. So the first bill was Senate Bill 188, and this one is for protections for accessing reproductive health care. So you'll see both this bill and the next bill are really around removing barriers to access. 188 was more about removing legal barriers to access, making sure that providers are protected and that patients are protected if you're coming from out of state or somewhere else, making sure that providers are protected when providing gender affirming care, and pieces around the legalities, making sure that providers are protected, that patients are protected, and in seeking out what is legally accessible in Colorado. This one we do expect to be challenged, and unfortunately, we've already seen some repercussions from Children's Hospital around gender affirming care, who don't think that the protections are quite high enough. So potentially this bill will be revisited in the next legislative session, as the goal and the intent is to make sure that all healthcare is legally accessible, especially in the reproductive health space. All right, the next one is Senate Bill 189, and this is increasing access by removing barriers around insurance and payment. So this clarifies medical and surprise billing around reproductive healthcare services. This includes sexually transmitted infections, vasectomies, hysterectomies, abortion. It also expands contraception and increases family planning services statewide. But the main goal is to make sure that if you are seeking healthcare services and you are covered by insurance, that you are not to receive a surprise bill, and that insurance is covering reproductive healthcare services. So you'll see the trend is to make sure the legal protections are high enough, removing payment barriers to care, and then the final piece in this trifecta is around deceptive trade practices, and so making sure that providers and patients alike are providing accurate information to patients. We see a lot of the pregnancy crisis centers, unfortunately, in Colorado, and this bill created a way to file a lawsuit based on deceptive trade practices against a crisis pregnancy center. And so this will really help tighten up the problems that we see with patients getting misinformation or being misled, getting free pregnancy tests and free ultrasounds prior to deciding whether or not they are going to keep the pregnancy. So this bill made that accessible for lawsuits. that is the, those are the big 3 reproductive health bills that happened this session. I'll take another quick pause and see if there are any questions on those. We'll also allow for questions at the end, in addition. So the next big set of legislation is around gun policy changes. And we saw 5 bills that were introduced this session, 4 that were passed, and 1, unfortunately, that did not pass, that was very political around banning assault rifles altogether. So the first bill is House Bill 1219, and this is the waiting period bill. This created a 3-day waiting period after the initiation of a background check when you purchase a firearm. So if you go into a, if you go into a store that sells firearms, you would ask to purchase the firearm. They would take down all the necessary information. They would initiate your background check. And from the point that you clear that background check until you are allowed to take that gun home, it has to be 72 hours or 3 days. That is all that this bill did. However, many of you might have seen in the news yesterday that these bills started to take effect. They were enacted after their 90-day waiting period from the time the governor signed the legislation. And we will start seeing court challenges. The Republicans, while they did fight this legislation, all of the bills, they were quoted several times in the press saying that they did not fight these bills as hard as they would like to because they plan to legally challenge them. So I believe that this is one bill that we will see a challenge on. It has not happened yet. However, there are waiting periods in other states. So hopefully we will see this one hold up.
Katie, we do have a question in the chat related to reproductive rights. It is, what about protections for advocates in Colorado who assist clients from other states to travel to Colorado for health services?
That's a great question. Thank you, Virginia. There are legal protections in 188, Senate Bill 188, that do protect legal advocates as well as community advocates in seeking any resources that are necessary to get the healthcare that they need. Okay, so the waiting period, 3 days now. The next bill is Senate Bill 170, and this one was to strengthen ERPO, or the red flag law. ERPO is extreme risk protection order, commonly referred to as red flag. This bill initially passed, I believe it was 4 years ago now, 2019, when this bill passed. And we have seen a pretty unequal application of this law across the state. It really depends on the county that you live in and the judges that live in that district, as well as law enforcement. So in order to strengthen ERPO, we wanted to expand the people who were able to file for an ERPO. And very similar to how we see protection orders done in cases of domestic violence, we also opened up the venues that you were able to file. So if you are a community or household member who is going to file an ERPO, you can now file either where you work or where you live or where the incident occurred. So 3 places, and that is to allow ease of access, noting that sometimes something happens in a county that's far away from you or makes it much harder for you to be able to facilitate an in-person court filing. This is not extended to judges or law enforcement officers, only because of the concern around the prejudicial nature that could happen if someone was able to file in a different district. So this is specifically if you are the survivor, if you are a family member or a household member. The main piece that that was opened up besides the venue was the amount of folks that can now report. It opened up a number of community members, including different types of providers. It increased the number of law enforcement officers, including DAs, and it increased and created definition around the household member component and what that relationship looks like. There are still concerns from the gun advocate, the anti-gun advocate community around additional protections and places to strengthen ERPO that we will likely see in this upcoming legislative session and in prior upcoming sessions. But they wanted to keep this pretty narrow to make sure that it was able to pass. All right. And so the other big bill that Violence Free supported in the gun policy change area was increasing the minimum age to purchase. This is the one that became active yesterday in Colorado state law and immediately was issued a stay by a federal judge based on a legal filing by Rocky Mountain Gun Owners, or RMGO, which were the main opponents in this, in all these bills. The bill raised the minimum age to buy a long gun from 18 to 21. Per federal law, you currently cannot buy a handgun until you are 21. And this would increase that for a long gun as well. The caveat here being that this is through a licensed firearm dealer, and that the other loopholes that remain in all other gun sales are still there, are still present. It also makes it illegal to purchase, but also to sell. So it also makes it illegal for the dealer to sell a gun to an individual, a long gun or a handgun, to someone younger than 21. Any questions on those first three? So there were three other bills. So there were six, I think I said five before, but Senate Bill 168 made it easier to sue gun manufacturers. This is something that started in the initial gun wars in 2013. And that unfortunately did not pass the time. However, they brought it back to make sure that if a gun does kill someone, that there is recourse for you to be able to sue that gun manufacturer based on the information provided and flags that were raised during the marketing process. The next bill that did pass and had much less attention was Senate Bill 23-279. And this was around ghost guns, or guns without serial numbers. So ghost guns are those that people are making at home with a parts kit and a 3D printer, and do not have serial numbers on them. So anything that you can do yourself at home or does not have a serial number for whatever reason are not legal in Colorado anymore, explicitly. And the final bill that I did mention at the beginning was the complete ban on assault weapons. Unfortunately, this failed bipartisanly in House Judiciary. Over 500 people signed up to come and testify on this legislation. And after, I believe it was like a 16 or 17-hour hearing, the bill did die. There were a lot of conversations about whether or not there should be negotiations and starting in a smaller place on the assault weapon ban. However, the legislative sponsors felt like it was too important to compromise on and will likely bring it back in upcoming legislative sessions. So that is a summary of the gun legislation that happened in 2023. I'm going to take a quick pause again and just see if there are any questions on those. All right. We're just flying through them. So the last section of bills that we really focused on, in addition to the other bills that had to do with domestic violence through criminal justice lens were child welfare and child custody bills. There were 5 specifically that we followed very closely, as well as a handful of others that we did keep an eye on and did not pass. So the first bill is House Bill 231178, and this one is Caden's Law. Caden's Law, I'm sure that you've heard of, is a national movement. It is, there is money through VAWA that if your state does pass Caden's Law and follow the judicial training requirements, Colorado could be eligible to receive federal funds for that. However, because of the way Colorado's constitution is written and how the legislature is not allowed to require the judicial branch to do anything, we did include a specific question to the judicial training task force that I mentioned at the beginning for them to look into Caden's Law and the requirements necessary. So when we see the recommendations from that task force, the hope is that we will see recommendations specifically catering to the requirements, the federal requirements for Caden's Law. In addition to that, Caden's Law also put higher parameters, barriers on those folks who are not judges who work with survivors and kiddos in the courtroom. So CFIs, child family investigators, parental responsibility evaluators, PREs, those folks are required to have a certain level of domestic violence training in order to be eligible to work on domestic violence cases. So there will be opportunities for trainings through Violence Free in case you are getting questions, as well as I know that there are national organizations who offer the training as well. The goal is for anyone who's working with a survivor or a kiddo in the courtroom on these cases to make sure that they have the proper expertise. The next bill is House Bill 1026, and this one is family time for grandparents. There were a lot of concerns from Violence Free's policy committee initially on this legislation and making sure that the way family time for grandparents was defined did not end up hurting survivors inadvertently. We worked very closely with the sponsor as well as the Bar Association and One Colorado, who had very similar concerns. So we were able to come to a conclusion on the bill that very closely mirrored how the law is currently set up for child welfare cases and in abuse and neglect. We basically transferred language that already exists from one title to another to make it easier to utilize in the courtroom, but without changing a lot of the premise for those who work in the courtroom. So while grandparents now have the ability and had the ability before in a similar way to be able to petition for family time, that will still exist, but not as robustly as the sponsor would have liked. I do think that we'll see another look at the family time for grandparents legislation again. The sponsor would like to expand it. This is a very specific and personal issue for her, as she has many grandkids and has one specifically that she does not get to see very often. So very frequently when these political issues become personal, it requires a little bit additional creative thinking and sensitivity to the subject to make sure that it isn't hurting the general public. House Bill 231004 was relative and kin placement of a child. This bill was a little bit more controversial and is taking a deeper dive into, oh, I'm sorry, I mixed these two up. So 1024 is actually a bill that came from the Colorado counties. We work with them very closely over the last 4 years in order to make sure that this legislation was appropriate, and that when placing a child, that there were different factors considered for survivors of domestic violence in that placement. while also prioritizing the best interests of the child and making sure that if there is a kin placement, that is prioritized. So we worked with the Office of the Respondent Parents Council, as well as the Office of the Child Representative and the counties to make sure that the language was correct. We did get to a place where we thought that it was at least equal to the current language that existed as far as any creation of harm. The next bill, House Bill 1027, Parent and Child Family Time, was more controversial. This one, we did not end up entirely in a place where we were happy. However, due to the nature of this session and how many child welfare bills there was a child welfare task force created. And there will be recommendations and legislation in the upcoming legislative session that will make changes and tweaks to 1027 based on recommendations from that task force and input from stakeholders like Violence Free Colorado. So if anyone is interested in getting more closely involved in the child custody conversation with the legislature, please let us know. We would love to have you in that conversation. And the last one is emergency and continued placement with relative or kin. This is kind of a partner bill to 1024. Both of them, the counties worked very closely on, and both were also worked very closely on with the foster parent community to make sure that we are advocating for the best interest of the child, kin placement, and the proper placement for those parties involved, including survivors. So the outcome of that legislation of all these bills were that they passed, and the only one that we had remaining concerns about was House Bill 1027, which I do believe we'll see changes to. So that is an overview of the big 5 child custody bills that we worked on this legislative session. And wraps up my presentation for the 2023 session. That gives us quite a bit of time for questions, so please don't hesitate to ask anything.
Katie, this is Brandy. I just wanted to thank you for that presentation while we're waiting to see if folks either want to unmute to ask a question or if they would like to type it in the chat. I can also put in the chat a link to the 2023 legislative report so folks can have that access to that, and we'll send out that link with a follow-up email as well. This is Brandy again. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll while you are all thinking of your questions, because this is a lot of information, a lot of content, and these laws are going to, impact us for quite a while, especially if there's changes in the next session. But I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. So if you all wouldn't mind filling that out. There's 3 questions on this poll, and your answers are anonymous.
And Katie, this is Virginia. I have another question in the chat box. What do you see as next steps in timetable, I'm sorry, for the state question 23-169? Does that make sense to you?
Let me stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Just look at the question. So 169 is it's one of the gun bills, and I just have to refresh my own memory. Oh, the minimum age to purchase. So that one, I did have some conversations this morning about what that will look like. as far as a legal challenge, and the advocates, the anti-gun advocates have already started working on an opposition to that stay. My guess is that we'll see in the next few weeks as that comes out. I have volunteered any help that we could give those folks. But I think as for now, like we'll have to argue that in court, and hopefully it doesn't continue to go up the chain. But I do think RMGO will try to push it as far up the court chain as possible, because the court gets friendlier to them the higher it goes.
This is Brandy again. Thank you all for being here and listening. And again, we want to encourage questions because I know sometimes things can get confusing when we think about laws. And also want to say thank you to Katie. Thank you to our interpreters and all of our staff support. We'll hang out just another couple minutes and see if folks have any other questions. And again, you can unmute yourselves or you can type a question into the chat. All right, it looks like we don't have any questions coming in the chat. We do have some kudos to Katie, so thanks again, Katie. Got some good love happening in the chat. For our follow-up to this webinar, we will send out the recording links and we'll send out the slides, and we'll also have a link to the survey as well as the legislative report. So all of that will be in our follow-up email. If you have questions, you all can reach out to us here at Violence Free, either Katie directly or any of the staff can make sure we point you in the right direction. So thank you all for being here, and we're going to go ahead and end our webinar a little bit early. And again, feel free to connect with us with questions. Just a little plug, September's Facts and Snacks will cover how to help survivors preparing to have contact with the media. So basically how advocates can support survivors with media contact. So be on the lookout for that announcement. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.